So a good thing to say when you're really questioning things of scripture is not just make stuff up, but say, I don't know. Just be open.
Right. And that's, I could be a wealthy man if I disguised speculation as Bible teaching, but I just won't do it. I detest it. So what I try to do is I try to get people to get sort of absorbed with the idea that, look, if we're going to call our theology biblical, we ought to be able to trace it to the Bible. That doesn't seem like an unreasonable thing to ask. And if you can't find something, just say, I don't know, Scripture's silent, and now I'm going to speculate, but I'm going to tell you I'm speculating. I'm not going to, again, not tell you and then call it Bible teaching. We're not going to do that because, Scripture doesn't have answers, to a number of things. The Bible never claims to be an exhaustive repository of everything that ever happened or could happen or everything that's real and true. It never claims that, but somehow we sort of treat it that way. I was on a podcast today, believe it or not, talking about if there was an extraterrestrial disclosure, does that harm Christianity? This is a really good example of this, where people try to answer these sorts of questions, and one of the impulse responses is, oh, extraterrestrials can't be real because they're not in the Bible. Well, like, neither is toilet paper. It's the dumbest thing in the world when you really think about it, but yet people will approach questions like this in that manner. It's just astonishing, but I've seen it so many times that it's a reflex. That you've got to get people to think about how they're thinking to really be helpful when you get a question.
Why do you think that reflex exists? What do you think conditions people to do that?
Ultimately, I think it's because of the way we're taught about the Bible. In other words, it's the way we're taught about how we got the Bible. The way that bibliology, the doctrine of inspiration, is taught in the average church today, the average serious church, is that the Bible just sort of dropped from heaven. Like the biblical prophets and the writers were went into trances, and like the Matrix, God plugged something into their heads, and then the book gets downloaded, and the prophet comes out of it and looks at the table and says, "Oh, I can't wait to read that." Like the brain is disengaged. In a nutshell, we treat the Bible like it's a channeled book. Okay, that's for UFO cults. All right, that's not biblical theology.
Right.
So if you're taught to think that way, then you get it sort of fosters this impression that whatever's in there is true, and therefore whatever's not in there is false. I mean, and that's a false way of thinking about the content. You forget that the Bible, every book had an agenda. I mean, that the writer had a purpose in writing. He has an audience, and there's something that needs to be addressed. Okay, it's not about, again, forming this data collective that is the culminative record of everything that's true. Everything that's not mentioned in here must be false. That it sort of defies the ordinariness of really what the Bible is. And so I like to say, look, if you strip the humanity out of the Bible, you undermine the doctrine of inspiration, because we've turned inspiration into an X-Files episode or channeling or something like that, when the reality is God is far more interested in the product of Scripture than that view allows. Okay, if it's a channeled book, then God was interested in giving us information occasionally for a few seconds every 200 years or something, as opposed to God providentially oversaw the lives of every hand that would ever touch this. He's providentially preparing them in their education, their life experience, the circumstances of life, good and bad, what bad things that happen to them, just the whole collective. God is in the process of molding this person and preparing them for the time and place when he is going to need them and prompt them to write something down for posterity. They are fully capable, fully equipped to do a good job. God has seen to it. And so now it's time to sit down at your table, pick up the pen, and write that letter. In other words, God engineers the circumstances of this person's life to make them the prime candidate to produce this thing, whatever portion of Scripture it is. That's what I call a providential view of inspiration. God is in the process the whole time. And most of the time it's invisible. It's the unseen hand of providence. And all of our lives work this way. This is why I like movies like, It's a Wonderful Life. You get to see what life would have been like if I'd have made the left turn instead of the right turn. Well, all of our lives are like, they turn on things that we don't even think about. And for the Christian, really for anybody who's a theist, the question is, do you believe that not only humans, flesh and blood humans, influence these decisions that not only you make, but the 100 decisions that preceded the one you made? Okay, is it only a human level activity, or does God have other agents, other means at his disposal that you never see to influence and create the context for an event for you to make that decision. And when you don't make the right decision, is God interested enough to try again? In other words, to move you to make the right decision, because he wants to partner with you. He wants you to be part of this bigger thing that he's building. That's a biblical worldview. We make the mistake of thinking God is only present in the spectacular. Okay, God is present most of the time in that we will never know unless we could take that retrospective look like the movies, do. That's really how life operates. And the inspiration of Scripture is part of it. That God is engaged the whole way, not just zapping, or channeling books, and it's really important for apologetics, but we don't need to rabbit trail there as to how Scripture was put together. But if you just think it's a channeled book, then you're going to think bad thoughts about, you're not going to think well about questions, like what we've been talking about. You're not going to be able to process the question intelligently if you have just a really poor view of how we even got there.
And unfortunately, Dr. Heiser, I believe a lot of the skeptics have latched on to the type of thinking that is that reflex that you're talking about and gives them the fodder for the skepticism.
Yeah. I mean, skeptics, your friendly skeptics, your militant atheists. I mean, so especially in the militant crowd, all they know how to do is use the caricatures. They don't add any clear thinking on their own part. They don't try to really reimagine what's a better way to think about this issue. Well, that would take work, and it might influence the way they think. It might take them in another direction. So what we're going to do is use the character. It's easy. It's lazy. There's just plenty of that to go around.